The recorder hit the table with a sharp crack, spinning once before Vivian Calloway stopped it flat with 2 fingers. "Play it," she said. Let them hear what she really said. Across from her, Douglas Kane didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the small black device like it might detonate on contact. For years. For years of silence, of biting her tongue at family dinners, of watching a woman in designer black smile through crocodile tears at a funeral while an entire town fell for the performance, and now, finally, the truth was about to speak for itself. In her own voice, in her own words. Vivian's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the play button, but her voice didn't shake at all. "Everyone in that room is about to understand exactly who Delphine Voss really is, Douglas. And this time, there's no talking her way out of it." Rewind. For years earlier, Harold Whitfield sat across from Douglas Kane in a modest office that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee, healthy, broad-shouldered, still strong enough to climb a construction scaffold himself if he wanted to prove a point to a younger foreman. "I want it airtight," Harold said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "Irrevocable. My kids get everything, the business, the land, the accounts. Nobody touches it. Not even me, 10 years from now if I lose my mind and try." Douglas raised an eyebrow, setting down his pen. "Not even you?" "Harold, that's unusual for a man in perfect health with no one else in the picture." Harold's jaw tightened, and something flickered behind his eyes, not quite fear, but the shadow of it. "I've built this from nothing, Douglas. Nothing. And I've seen what money does to people who didn't earn it, what it does to families when somebody new walks in with the right smile and the wrong intentions. I want my children protected from the world and maybe, someday, from someone I haven't even met yet." He laughed a little, almost embarrassed by his own paranoia. He didn't know how right he'd be. 2 years later, Delphine Voss walked into Harold's life like sunlight through a window he didn't know was dirty. She was warm, attentive, endlessly complimentary, the kind of woman who remembered exactly how he liked his coffee after only one visit. "Harold, you work too hard," she'd coo, refilling his cup before he even asked, resting a hand on his shoulder just a beat too long. He melted for it, the way lonely men sometimes do. But Vivian noticed things her father didn't want to see. The way Delphine forgot to mention Sunday dinners until it was too late to attend. The way she'd answer Harold's phone with a honeyed voice and say, "He's resting, sweetheart, call back later," when Vivian knew for a fact her father had been wide awake, restless, pacing the kitchen only an hour before. "She's just trying to fit in," Harold told Vivian one afternoon, waving off her concern with the back of his hand. "Give her time, Vivi. Not everyone adjusts to a new family overnight." Vivian forced a smile she didn't feel. "I hope you're right, Dad." She wasn't convinced. Not even a little. The diagnosis came on a gray January morning: pancreatic cancer, aggressive, terminal, 12 to 18 months if he was lucky, the doctor said, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water, rippling outward until nothing felt steady anymore. Delphine's transformation was instant and total. Overnight, she became gatekeeper, nurse, guardian, and warden all at once, rearranging furniture, rearranging schedules, rearranging who was allowed to matter. The doctors said absolutely no stress, she told Renee at the door one afternoon, physically blocking her from even stepping inside the foyer. "You understand, I'm sure." Vivian finally snapped one evening, standing in the driveway under a dying porch light, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles went pale. "He's my father, Delphine. You don't get to decide who sees him and who doesn't." Delphine's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold as steel, flat and unblinking. "I'm his wife, Vivian. That makes it exactly my decision, whether you like it or not." The words hit like a slap across the face, and Vivian stood there a long moment after the door closed, fists shaking at her sides. That night, Vivian sat in her car outside her father's house, hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached, and made a decision that would change everything that came after. She was a corporate attorney. She knew how to build a case, how to gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed later as jealousy or grief-fueled imagination. She bought a small recorder the next morning, slipped it into her coat pocket before her next visit, and began documenting every conversation, every dismissive comment, every carefully constructed lie. Weeks later, she nearly got caught, Delphine reaching for her coat to hang it up properly near the front closet, Vivian's heart hammering as she casually intercepted it first, feigning a laugh. "I've got it, don't worry yourself," she said, forcing calm into a voice that wanted to crack. Delphine studied her for a moment too long, eyes narrowing just slightly, before turning away with a shrug that didn't quite reach her shoulders. On one of his better days, when the fog of medication lifted just enough, Harold pulled Vivian close, his grip weaker than she remembered, but his eyes sharp and afraid in a way she'd never seen on her father before. "Vivi, listen to me," he whispered, glancing toward the door like a man checking for guards. "She's been asking Douglas questions about changing the will. A different lawyer. Someone new, someone she found on her own." Vivian's stomach dropped through the floor. "Dad, who? Did she give you a name?" Harold shook his head slowly, frustration creasing his forehead. "I don't know his name. But she thinks I don't remember our conversations anymore, thinks the medications turned my brain to fog. I remember everything, Vivi. Every single word." Tears welled hot in Vivian's eyes as she gripped his hand between both of hers. "I won't let her take what's ours, Dad. I promise you that. I swear it on everything I have." Harold squeezed back with what little strength remained in his fingers. "I know you won't. That's exactly why I'm not afraid to close my eyes at night anymore." It took 3 more weeks of careful, patient, exhausting work before Vivian caught the conversation that changed absolutely everything. Hidden in the hallway outside her father's study, recorder running silently in her palm, she heard Delphine's voice, low and conspiratorial, speaking to a man Vivian didn't recognize at all. "Once he's gone, we can test the trust," the man said, voice smooth with practiced confidence. "I've done this before, Delphine." Courts side with grieving spouses more than people think, especially when the paperwork's old enough to poke holes in. Delphine's laugh was sharp, greedy, unmistakably delighted. "Those ungrateful brats have had everything handed to them their whole lives, Marcus. It's time somebody smart finally got a turn at this family's money." Vivian's blood ran cold, ice spreading through her chest. Marcus Reed, she'd heard that name before, whispered in legal circles back at her firm, always followed immediately by the word disbarred, always trailing a reputation for preying on dying men and grieving families. Harold Whitfield died on a quiet Tuesday morning in November, surrounded by his children, sunlight slanting gold through the curtains, his hand in Vivian's until the very last breath left him. The room was heavy with grief, sobs breaking the silence in waves, Renee collapsing into Julian's arms, Julian himself fighting to stay steady for his sisters. Delphine wept too, loudly, theatrically, dabbing at eyes with a lace handkerchief she'd clearly chosen days in advance, but moments later, when the room had emptied and she believed no one was listening, her eyes turned bone-dry in an instant. Finally, she murmured to her sister Marlene, who had slipped in quietly to comfort her. "Those ungrateful kids get nothing." Vivian, still in the hallway retrieving a tissue box, froze mid-step, every syllable landing like a physical blow she'd somehow half expected and still couldn't fully absorb, her chest tightening around the words like a fist. The funeral was a performance of grief so convincing that half of Ashford Hollow wept alongside Delphine, praising her devotion, her strength, her sacrifice through what everyone assumed had been the hardest year of her life. Vivian stood at the edge of the crowd in black, jaw clenched so tight it ached, watching her father's widow accept condolences like an actress accepting applause after a closing curtain. "She doesn't get to do this," Vivian whispered to Renee, voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Do what?" Renee asked, voice raw from crying. "Steal his memory the same way she tried to steal his money," Vivian said. Renee's eyes widened, confusion and alarm flickering across her face. "Vivian, what on earth are you talking about?" Vivian shook her head firmly. "Not here. Not yet. But soon, I promise you, soon. Everyone in this town is going to know exactly who she is and what she was planning while Dad was dying." 1 week later, The family gathered in Douglas Kane's office for the reading of the will, the air thick with attention nobody dared name aloud, chairs arranged like opposing sides of a courtroom nobody had agreed to enter. Delphine arrived in black again, composed, almost smug, seated beside Marcus Reed like royalty flanked by a hired bodyguard. "Shall we begin?" Douglas asked, and the room fell utterly silent, save for the ticking of an old wall clock. He read through the modest will first, the house, a joint savings account, roughly $52,000, all left to Delphine outright. Her lips curved into a satisfied, private smile, the smile of a woman who'd already started planning renovations. Then Douglas cleared his throat and turned a page. However, the bulk of Harold's estate, the construction business, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, totaling just over $3.1 million, was placed into an irrevocable trust in 2018 for his 3 children. Established years before his diagnosis and completely outside the reach of the will. The color drained from Delphine's face in an instant, like a switch had been flipped. "That's impossible," she snapped, rising halfway out of her chair, knuckles white against the armrest. "He would have told me. He promised me the house wasn't all I'd get. He promised me." Marcus Reed's composure cracked too, his eyes darting toward the door like a man already calculating an exit route. "This trust, it can be contested," he said quickly, too quickly, but Douglas simply slid a thick folder across the table without raising his voice. "Try. It's ironclad, drafted and witnessed years before you ever met him, Ms. Voss. There isn't a court in this state that will touch it." Delphine's mask, the one she'd worn flawlessly for 3 long years, finally shattered completely into something raw and ugly. "You people have had everything handed to you your whole lives," she spat at Vivian, Renee, and Julian, voice shaking with a fury she could no longer disguise as grief. "I gave that man years of my life. Years." Vivian stood slowly, her hands steady now for the first time in months, and pulled the small recorder from her bag, setting it deliberately on the table between them. "You gave him years of lies," she said, voice cutting clean through the stunned silence of the room. "And I have proof of every single one of them." She pressed play. Delphine's own voice filled the office, cold and unmistakable, Marcus's plan to contest the trust laid out in plain, damning detail, her greedy laughter curling through the speaker, and then, worst of all, the whispered words from the funeral hallway crackling into the room like a confession. "Finally. Those ungrateful kids get nothing." Renee gasped audibly, hand flying to her mouth, tears springing fresh to her eyes. Julian's fists clenched at his sides, jaw working like he was holding back words that would only make things worse. Delphine's face went white, then a deep, humiliated red, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out at all, the performance of the grieving widow collapsing into something exposed and small in front of everyone she'd spent years trying to fool. "You recorded me?" Delphine finally shrieked, lunging half a step forward before Douglas raised a firm, steady hand between them. "That's illegal. That's legal in this state. Actually," Douglas said calmly, without a flicker of doubt, "when one party consents to the recording. Vivian is an attorney, Delphine. Did you honestly think she wouldn't know the law before she started this?" Marcus Reed was already gathering his briefcase with shaking hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, already calculating how fast he could disappear from a room that was about to end his career for good, again. Delphine turned on him, fury boiling over into something almost feral. "You said this would work. You told me this would work, you said. I said I'd try," Marcus muttered, not even pausing at the door, "and I did. That's on you now." He walked out without another word, leaving her alone in the wreckage of a scheme years in the making, undone in the space of a single recording. The days that followed unraveled quickly, the way things always do once the truth finally breaks the surface. Word spread through Ashford Hollow the way it always does in small towns, fast, merciless, entirely without sympathy for the guilty party. Neighbors who had once praised Delphine's devotion at every dinner party now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering behind cupped hands as she passed. The country club quietly rescinded her membership within the month. Marcus Reed faced a formal bar investigation almost immediately, his name dragged through local papers alongside a growing list of contested wills and predatory estate schemes stretching back over a decade. Delphine moved out of the house within 2 weeks, boxes stacked haphazardly in a rented truck, her once flawless reputation reduced to hushed whispers and pointed stares wherever she dared show her face. The very town she'd tried so hard to charm now the stage for her very public unraveling. Vivian sat with Renee and Julian on the porch of their father's house that final week before it sold, the three of them quiet, watching the sun sink slow and orange behind trees Harold had planted decades before with his own 2 hands. He knew, Julian said softly, turning a glass of iced tea between his fingers without drinking it. He knew something like this could happen, even before she came along. That's why he set up the trust in the first place. Renee wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. He protected us before we even knew we needed protecting. Vivian nodded, throat tight, watching the last light fade over the yard. He protected us because he loved us more than he trusted anyone else's promises, more than he trusted his own eyes sometimes, near the end. That's not something you get from money, Julian. That's something you earn by paying close attention to who someone really is, long before the mask ever slips in front of everyone else. The siblings sat in silence a while longer, grief and gratitude tangled together in the fading porch light. A year later, Renee ran the construction business her father built from nothing, Julian managed its biggest and most demanding projects, and Vivian opened a small legal practice in Ashford Hollow focused entirely on protecting elderly clients from exactly the kind of manipulation that had nearly stolen their inheritance and their father's dignity in his final year. Marcus Reed was permanently disbarred that spring, his name synonymous with disgrace among every attorney in 3 counties. Delphine, it was said, eventually remarried another wealthy older widower 2 towns over, a man who'd never heard the whispers that followed her name back home, though those who knew her story watched from a careful distance, quiet, knowing eyes waiting to see if history would simply repeat itself for some other unsuspecting family down the road. Some patterns, Vivian often thought late at night, don't break on their own. They just find new victims, unless somebody is paying attention closely enough to stop them. The Whitfield children established a scholarship in their father's name that following year, funding business education for working-class students who reminded them of the man Harold had once been, self-made, cautious to a fault, fiercely protective of the people he loved even when he couldn't say it out loud. At the small ceremony, Vivian stood at the podium in front of a room of strangers and said only this, "My father taught me that love isn't loud and greed isn't quiet, but truth, eventually, always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes to climb there. Protect the people who can't protect themselves anymore, because somewhere, someone is counting on you to notice what they can't say out loud themselves." She stepped down to quiet applause, thinking of a single whispered sentence in a funeral hallway, and the 4 long years it had taken to answer it completely, and for good.